Today's subject, so we're going to look at the sheet in a moment, but I'll ask you first to listen, because as a human nature, we cannot do two things at once. At least men can't. Women can, men can't. So we cannot read and listen at the same time. Barely do one thing at a time. Okay. So what's the subject? The subject here is, it may or may not be familiar. Chodosh, new grain versus old grain. What's the story of the new grain versus old grain? The Torah says as follows. We read this 2 weeks ago. The Torah says like this: nobody may partake of the new crop until there is a special offering that is brought on behalf of the entire people. This offering is essentially a thanksgiving. It's not unlike making a bracha before you eat. A person may not benefit, eat, or even smell an aroma from anything in the world until one acknowledges the gift that comes from Hashem. Otherwise, it's a kind of misappropriation or theft. Hey, this is not your world. Why are you appropriating it? The answer is God wants you to and gives it to us, so we need to acknowledge that. That's the bracha. So likewise, there's this general offering. It's the OMER offering. OMER means a measure, a dry measure. It's a dry measure. 1/10 of an ephah, as it happens to be, and it's about a quart and a bit of dry measure. So the Torah says, of the first crop that ripens. Torah doesn't identify which crop that is, but the reality in our sages state, and I think it's actually passed down orally from God to Moses. Which crop are we talking about? The first one, barley. Barley is the first crop to ripen. It's now going to be harvested at the beginning of the summer, which is Pesach, beginning of the harvest season. So you have to bring an OMER offering. So the law is, nobody may eat of the new crop until that OMER offering is brought. It has to have taken root at least before the OMER offering is brought. So what it means in simple language, you have a piece of bread in front of you, a piece of cake, grain, cereal, whatever. Can you eat it or not? So the time of the temple, you had to know, was this around when the offering was brought? If it was planted after Pesach and grew and harvested and never experienced the OMER offering, which is brought on the second day of Pesach, can't eat it. It's put in the silo. You have to wait until the OMER offering of next year is brought, and then you can partake of it. Clear? Nobody can partake of the OMER offering of the new grain until this grain was around when the OMER offering was brought on its behalf. Now I can eat it. So the language is chodosh and yosher. Chodosh means new grain. New grain is forbidden to eat. What does new mean in our context? Grain that took root after the second day of Pesach. You have to wait till the next second day of Pesach. Old grain, yosher, is permissible to eat. Now, the discussion is, does it apply nowadays? If you read the Chumash outright, it sounds like it does. It says in all your dwelling places, everywhere. Does it mean everywhere in Israel? Does it mean even in diaspora? Does it mean only when the temple stands? Or it doesn't apply after there's no longer a temple, there's no longer an offering? So the fact is that many authorities, the majority of authorities, say that it applies even after the temple is destroyed and outside the land of Israel. So you have to wait for that day. There's no actual offering, but that's that day. Was this grain around? Did it take root before the second day of Pesach? Was it planted and taken root before? There are authorities that say it doesn't apply if it belongs to a non-Jew, and some say it doesn't apply outside Israel. So there are some people, this is an interesting thing. As you all know, Hasidim in general, in the observance of mitzvahs, go above and beyond the letter of the law. That's kind of one of the unique hallmarks of the Hasidic world. Chabad, all Hasidim. Two pairs of tefillin, and everything is with added nuance beyond the law. In this case, it's interesting that Hasidim are not particular about this law. They rely on the opinion that it doesn't apply after the temple is destroyed, doesn't apply outside Israel, etc. Within the non-Hasidic world, there's a segment. They are careful, without going to why this is so, they are careful about the law of Chodesh and Yoshan. So therefore you might notice, and probably in Utrama I didn't see it, but I would imagine there's at least one baker in Utrama that has a sign in the window. Certainly you see this in Borough Park and maybe Williamsburg. We only sell Yoshan products. We only sell old product, old. Our grain is old. We make sure that the grain that we use to make our bakery products experienced a second day of Pesach. So when you see that, from now on, you're going to, I know what that means. But again, Chabad and general Hasidim and most of the Jewish world are not particular about this and rely on the opinions that it doesn't apply to grain owned by a non-Jew and so on. And so that's the final ruling. Okay, finished. Law number 1, clear? Now, if you look at I'll ask you to look at the sheet that I sent you. And you'll have to be very disciplined and follow the sheet as I guide you. Don't read further because you won't understand it and I'll talk and you won't hear me. And you got up so early in the morning, I didn't get anything. All right, so stay with me. I'm looking now at the left box. That's it. So we're looking at. On the second day of Pesach, Korban the OMER offering allows personal consumption. In the words of the Mishnah, so I'm quoting the Mishnah, Matir b'Medina, it allows, Medina means the countryside, individuals to eat of the new crop. Then the Torah says, look at the dotted line. Then the Torah says, as you all know, count 49 days, 7 weeks. Now bring another offering. A new Yom Tov, it's called Shavuos. We can look at the second box. Let's look at it. Now the Torah says you bring 2 breads, 2 loaves of bread. Again, this is behalf, not everybody brings it. It's one offering on behalf of the entire population. Likewise, the OMER offering. It's one on behalf of everybody. 2 breads, 2 large loaves of bread, chometz. We'll talk about that soon. In brackets, together with 2 sheep. This is important. And what does this allow for? Allows offerings in Beis HaMikdash. In Hebrew, Matir b'Mikdash, this is the words of the Mishnah. Gavoya means the one above. It means as follows. Grain was an integral part of the offerings in the Beis HaMikdash. It wasn't just the offerings of particular kosher animals. Every animal offering was accompanied by a mincha, which is called in English a meal offering. Meal means grain, made in different ways, it's described at length, and a wine libation, nisuchayayin. Without going to explaining all the details why, obviously, just the fact. Then there are certain offerings an individual will bring, which is to begin with only grain. It's integral to his offering. Personal offerings and public offerings all involved grain, period. They're called mincha. Mincha means a gift, literally. A gift of grain. Why is this? All offerings are a gift. Why is this called a gift? One of the reasons is because there are some offerings you have a choice. You can bring an animal, a bird, or grain. Who's going to bring grain? The poor person who can't afford the bird and can't afford the animal. When he gives, he's giving of himself much more than the rich person. That's called a mincha. God says it's only grain, but if that's all you can give, then this is a wonderful gift. Thank you. That's just in brackets why it's called mincha. Now, why we called mincha? Mincha is another question. The afternoon prayer is called mincha. Why? Another question, another discussion. But same really answer. The same answer. Because mincha means a grain offering. That's brought in the morning. It's also brought, every sacrifice is a mincha. In the morning too, shachris. But in the middle of the day, to stop what you're doing and daven, that you're giving a gift. That's the mincha. That's precious. It's shorter, not long, and not talis, not film, but you're stopping everything, especially in the winter, and you daven, oh, this is very precious. So that gets the appellation mincha. Shachris is called, shachris means morning. Arvis, evening, is called arvis, evening. You think mincha will be called midday or afternoon. No, it's called gift. Because the daven in the middle of the day, that's a gift. That shows that you're really committed. That's what's a precious prayer. Okay, that was all in parentheses. Let's get back to Shavuos. So Shavuos, so the Torah is like this. To bring the new crop, not only do you have to wait for the OMER offering to use it as a korban, you have to wait 7 more weeks and wait till the 2 breads are offered, then you can bring it as a korban. So if you're bringing a mincha offering of grain, there's 2 considerations you have to have. First of all, it has to have taken root before It has to be in existence, taken root before Pesach. So therefore, if you have such grain, it was planted 2 weeks before Pesach, and then in the in-between 7 weeks, it grew and you harvested it, so it satisfies that it took root before Pesach, but it didn't experience Shavuos yet. SHTEI HALECHEM. You can't use this grain as an offering. You got to wait for this grain till the 2 breads are offered. That's the law. Now let's read it in that box again. This is what the Mishnah states. So the verse is saying it. The 2 breads together with the 2 sheep allows offering in Beis HaMikdash. Matir b'mikdash gavoya. Good. Clear? So we have, just to explain the basis of these 2 offerings. One thank you at the beginning of the harvest season, barley. Another thank you at the end of the harvest season, when the wheat, which is the last to ripen, is harvested. OMER offering here, 2 breads here. OMER offering here allows for personal consumption. The 2 breads allows for the new grain to be actually used as an offering. In between the 7 weeks. Now look at the middle between the 2 boxes. The Mishnah says like this. After the OMER offering was brought, if somebody didn't wait for Shavuos, they brought it a korban. They didn't wait. You're supposed to wait. So says the Mishnah b'di'evet, post facto, it's valid. But before the OMER, but if you brought crop that never experienced, if you brought an offering that never experienced the OMER offering, it took root after the OMER's offering, and you're bringing that, then it's invalid. But as long as it's a little bit earlier and it experienced the offering of the OMER, it is valid. In the words of the Mishnah, im hevi kosher. You should wait for Shavuos, but if you, at least this grain was grain that experienced the OMER offering, because it took root before, it is after the fact kosher. So there's many laws like this in halacha, many laws. You should do it this way, but if you respect at least some basic laws and you didn't respect all of the details, after the fact it's acceptable. All right, now we're going to explain. Are we clear? Summary? Summary is clear. You have to understand why. What's the reason? What's the reason that if I take grain that grew after the 2nd day of Pesach and I bring it as a korban, it's absolutely invalid. If I take grain that at least grew before Pesach, was planted before Pesach, even though I didn't wait for Shavuos, then after the fact it's kosher. Why is it? Why do we have this leeway? Why is this law more lenient? So 3 views. As you can see, 3 explanations. The beauty is going to be, friends, I'm going to explain this all spiritually, but let's get this down. We'll move through it quickly. Explanation number 1. Let's read it in the text and I'll explain it. In essence, it's one prohibition lifted in 2 stages, hence weakened. What's this view saying? This is the view. God is saying to the Jew, don't touch the new crop. It's one prohibition. Don't touch it. You may not use it. Now, then, once the OMER's offering is brought, we lift off, we weaken the prohibition. You can now use it. Once you bring the SHTEI HALECHEM, you can now use it for the mikdash. So the prohibition is lifted in stages. It's first a blanket, don't use it. After the OMER, you may, privately. After the SHTEI HALECHEM on Shavuos, you may use it as a korban. And therefore, since after the OMER, it's already a weakened prohibition, you should respect it, but because it's a weakened prohibition, after the fact it's kosher. It's been reduced in its severity because you respected at least one of it was lifted in part, and which you respected. This is grain that took root before the 1st day of Pesach. We're clear? So it's one prohibition lifted in stages. Once it's lifted in stage 1, it's now the net result is a weakened prohibition, and therefore, even if it's not respected, your offering is valid. We're clear? Explanation number 2, no, it's not one prohibition, it's 2 prohibitions. They're independent. However, one is absolute, unconditional, and the second, to begin with, is not absolute. And in brackets, I tell you why, without going to this depth, since HALECHEM require repeated prohibition to be absolute. There's a principle in the Talmud when it comes to laws related to sacrifices, To be absolute, the Torah has to repeat it twice. If it says it only once, it means you should, but if you didn't, it's still kosher. This prohibition is not said twice, so therefore, if you didn't wait for Shavuos, you should, but you didn't, then your offering is kosher. So there's two prohibitions. The first is absolute, the second is not absolute. Unlike the first one, it says it's one prohibition lifted in stages. Now the third view, you're following this? Most interesting view. There's only one prohibition. If you look at the reading the text, all it says is, when the Torah uses the language don't, all it uses only one when it comes to private consumption. Don't eat the new crop till you bring the new OMER. It doesn't say don't bring a korban till you bring the two breads. It says the two bread should be your first. In the text, there's only one prohibition. When it comes to the two breads, the Torah doesn't phrase it as a prohibition. The Torah's intent solely is that the HALECHEM should be the first korban of the new crop. It should be a mincha chadasha. Therefore, don't bring it before. But it doesn't say the word don't. It just says Shavuos should be the first offering of the new crop. So since it doesn't say don't, the Torah doesn't address any prohibition. So this is what happens therefore. If I wait for Pesach, it took root before. My grain is kosher for personal consumption. I may bring it as a korban, it's 100% good. But what have I done? I've messed up Shavuos. Shavuos is no longer going to be the first crop, but there's nothing inherently wrong with my korban. There's only one prohibition. Shavuos is a separate discussion. You want Shavuos to be the first. So what's the practical difference between the three views? Between 2 and 3? As follows. So somebody went ahead and did that. Once they brought a korban in between the period. They brought theirs, right? They waited. It took root before the first day of Pesach. They respected that. They brought their korban. Can I bring another one before Shavuos? Can somebody else bring? So the first two views will say no. Just because you didn't respect this weaker prohibition doesn't mean others shouldn't. You got to wait. You've got to wait till Shavuos. It's kosher after the fact, but the prohibition is still there. It's not an absolute prohibition. It's a prohibition that allows for after the fact. But if you're asking, respect it. But the third view will say, go ahead. There's no prohibition here. The whole point is that Shavuos should be the first. It's no longer the first. That can never be retrieved. You got it in earlier. Shavuos will not be the first. There's no reason why other people can't bring their offerings of the new crop, provided they respected Pesach, provided it took root before the first day of Pesach, provided they respected the OMER offering that was around before the OMER offering was brought. You see the answer? Once brought, may other such minchas may also be brought. One and two will say no. Third view will say yes. Okay. Friends, okay, this is early in the morning. This was Talmudic learning a little bit. We went a little bit deeper, explaining the Mishnah. Now we're going to get to the spiritual part. If you look at the bottom of the page, let's look at a legend that tells you what the things represent, and then we'll explain it. OMER, as we told you, is barley. Barley traditionally is animal fodder. I put in brackets the word soita. I'll explain it in a moment. It's not chametz. It's brought on the second day of Pesach. Of course, it's not chametz, the barley that's brought. And as you all know, not chametz, matzah. Matzah means unleavened grain, bread, represents self-negation. We all know this. Matzah, we spoke about this, rises, represents self-expression, the ego. Not matzah, bread, chametz. Not chametz, which remains flat, like a receptacle, to receive. It's not about expression, it's about self-negation. What is brought of? It's brought of barley. And I put in brackets the soita. As we said before, meal offerings is integral to all the offerings in the Beis Hamikdash. They're all made of wheat. All of them. Whoever's bringing the sinner, the one gives thanksgiving, the kohen gadol, it's always wheat. There's like two exceptions. And all of the many offerings, the barley offering of the second day of Pesach, the OMER, and the soita. What's the story with the soita? You know the story. The soita is a husband says to his wife, I'm suspicious about you and such a person. Please do not be in seclusion with him alone for enough time for intimacy to take place. Now, before we go further, just on the subject, that's a law, period. A man may not be in seclusion with a woman other than his wife or immediate family, period, at any time. Now, I want to add, it's not just because of what it could lead to. It's an intimacy that's inappropriate. When the door is closed, there's a certain electricity in the air, certain intimacy that's not appropriate unless she's your wife or mother and daughter. That's a different kind of intimacy. And I think I've mentioned this to you, it's such a beautiful law if you're all respected. And doctors and lawyers, especially doctors, would have saved, and insurance companies are only billions in insurance claims, never alone with a person. She says he did something, he said she did something, and the onus is to prove that you're innocent. And this is the door is always open, there's always a nurse. And there are many doctors have adopted this. They will not treat a woman unless, or if a guy nowadays, even a guy, unless there's somebody else in the room, or the door is open and it can be seen. It's a very healthy law, very healthy for everybody. But the reason for it is not because of what it could lead to. Sure, that's obviously part of it, but it's to be appreciated that being alone, unless someone's sexually dead, but if you're sexually alive, being alone is already an intimacy that, without saying anything, just being alone, it's something. There should be electricity in the room. That's inappropriate unless it's your wife. You know what is a healthy marriage? A healthy marriage is, I think I mentioned this to you, is when a husband and wife are alone in the room. Well, it's just alone. She's reading, he's doing the dishes, or the other way around. And you walk in and you feel like you're invading. You should. You should. It's a man, they're alone in the room. There's something they're not even engaging in anything yet, but you feel like, excuse me, you're invading. That's a healthy marriage that has this kind of healthy tension or electricity between them. So what's the story of the SHTEI? The SHTEI is, he said, he's suspicious. And then she went ahead and did it. There were witnesses that she was alone. So she's tested. Now, if she's innocent, she's blessed, and so on. And if not, there's the consequences for her and the man, wherever he is in the world, that they had relations. Now, part of her process, she has to bring a korban, an offering. It's part of the waters that she has to drink from. And it's made of barley. It's the only exception, and the offering. Why is that of barley? Say our sages, she did an animalistic thing. It should not have happened, even in seclusion, even if nothing happened. So her atonement is going to be an atonement of barley. She's dealing with the animal within that she needs to address. I'm going to add in brackets, interesting thing, that the Talmud says that women didn't have, because one of the blessings is, if she's innocent, that if she doesn't have children, she'll have children. So the women that didn't have children would do this. They'd create this whole thing that, as if they're having an affair, the husband's suspicious, and he tells her don't, and there's no affair, there's nothing, and she's in seclusion, and then she gets tested and she has children. So the sages discontinued it for this and other reasons. The other reason is because it only works if the husband himself is innocent in his own private life. If he's not innocent, then his wife will not be tested. So people started saying she was guilty and nothing happened to her, that's because he's guilty. And so the whole thing was discontinued for these two reasons, extreme reasons. It was being used for a mitzvah and was being abused by an unfaithful husband. He's not faithful and he's saying she shouldn't be alone. So for these reasons, the whole thing didn't work and was dropped. But I'm just telling you this, that the SHTEI brings a barley offering because she has to deal with this animalistic thing. Now the OMER is also, it's also barley. Why are we bringing barley? The simple answer is this is the first grain to ripen. What's the deeper meaning? It represents the animal within. And the animal is the first grain to ripen within us. We're born selfish, friends. We're born with that nefesh bahamis. The animal soul dominates. Kids are cute, babies are cute, but they're selfish. Completely wrapped up in self. Don't know from anything other than me. I'm tired, I'm cold, I'm hot, I need to burp, I need to relieve myself. That's pretty much it. I'm hungry. Then at age 12 and 13, the godly soul, nefesh HaLekis, starts to enter. It comes later. So the barley ripens first because the nefesh bahamis, the animal soul, is it's our dominant and first consciousness. That's what barley means. So we'll say right now, let's explain. Pesach is the rebirth of our people. It's on a spiritual level. It's a rebirth of our whole identity as being Jewish every year. And a journey begins from there. A journey that culminates with Shavuos and then continues from there. So what does this mean spiritually? Spiritually, the Torah says, do not benefit from the world. Life, you're born, beautiful world out there, until you bring the barley offering, the animal offering. That means the animal within. This is on many levels, but it's all one package. The foundation of a relationship with God has to be this element of sacrifice, namely an acknowledgement that life, it does not revolve around me alone and my physical needs and desires and pleasures. That's the foundation. That's the foundation. So before you benefit from the world, you bring the OMER offering. It's like the first thing is the yoke on the animal. The yoke of heaven is the very first thing that a person has to accept. Before he can begin on this journey of mitzvahs and learning and Torah. Of course, a person can do mitzvahs without accepting the yoke, but we're talking the ideal path, the ideal journey of in life. It's got to start with a commitment. It's got to start with an acknowledgement that there's a creator. It's got to start with an acknowledgement that life is not simply about me and amassing whatever it is, and enjoyment and pleasure, but there's something higher, a dedication to something higher in life. And that's not negotiable. That's not the law of the Korban OMER is it's not negotiable. Don't start your mitzvahs until there's an acknowledgement that there's a creator and again, any mitzvah is always acceptable. We're talking about in the ideal mode and model. It's not negotiable. It's not negotiable. Before you begin the journey, is an acknowledgement. It's not, there's an Eibishter, there's a yoke, there's responsibilities. And that's the bringing of the OMER offering. And there has to be not chametz. It's barley because we're dealing with the animal within me. It has to be not chametz because not chametz means my opinion right now I'm not interested in. My contribution, my ego. We're surrendering the ego. That's how it starts with. In the words of our sages, Kabbalas Malchus Shamayim, accepting the yoke of heaven. That's not chametz. That's self-nullification, accepting the yoke, surrender, doesn't rise, flat, receive. Hear what you're being told, my child. That's the foundation. And that's not negotiable. Then at the end of the process is the two breads. It's bread, it's made of wheat, and it's chametz. So friends, already it's 7 o'clock. So that will explain next week the significance of the two breads offered on Shavuos and the two sheep. Actually, you know what happened? The crane had to be very strong. This is a wave offering. He waved it in all 6 directions, as he had to wave also the OMER offering. 2 massive loaves of bread in between 2 live sheep. The kohen, Yoina, strong, pick up. Yoina is Johnny Schechter. Yortzeit was this past week. Ari's here. So Yoina was strong. You had to be strong to be a kohen. He picks up the 2 loaves and the 2 sheep in between, raises them, and waves them all 6 directions. So we're going to explain the spiritual significance of 2 loaves and the 2 sheep in between. I'll just tell you now, to throw into the fray, one of the reasons we have a dairy and meat meal, one of the reasons on Shavuos is to represent the 2 loaves brought on Shavuos. You have 2 breads, you're supposed to wash for both meals. A milchik meal with a milchik knife, maybe milchik bread, which you don't usually do, but you have a milchik meal, and you have a meat meal. What's going to make them 2 separate meals? The fact that you have 2 breads, 2 foods, 2 dishes. Why are we having 2 meals on Shavuos? There are many reasons, but one of them is to represent the 2 breads on Shavuos. What we're going to explain next week is the spiritual significance. We're going from not chametz to dafka chametz, and 2 breads and the 2 sheep. And what is this offering? I gave my offering already. I gave my offering. I accepted the yoke of heaven. Isn't that enough? I've accepted that life isn't about the animal soul. I'm dedicated to a path of spiritual growth. 49 days. Not boom, come Shavuos. I'm sorry. And you offering. However, this new offering is, if you didn't, we'll still accept you. Your mitzvahs are still good. You should, but explain all of this spiritually. So first explain, what is this new offering? What am I missing? I brought my animal soul. I did the Pesach thing. And I'm building on that. And I'm growing in my Yiddishkeit. What now? So we're going to explain the two offerings of Shavuos and why it is not so negotiable, why it is negotiable on some degree. And if we have time, the three views, three levels of spirituality. The three views, explanations. Three explanations as to what level the SHTEI HALECHEM is. One level, a higher level, and a higher level still. Okay? But if time, we'll look at it next week. And next week is 1 second. Next week is out of Shabbos, out of Shavuos, we'll be able to learn. All right, friends, have a wonderful Shabbos. I hope you gained.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rabbi. Shabbos.
Keep the
Shabbos.
papers.
Shabbos, everyone.
You know what,
Shabbos.
friends, if you could print out the paper, it'll help you to review. It'll be a good thing. Okay, let's stop the recording.
Good Shabbos. Thank you.
Good Shabbos.
All the very best to you all.